Hey guys, let's wait for 2 more minutes. All right, I think let's get started. So today's agenda is going to be James Peach is going to talk about the design for Mesos PAM support. I think there's a link to that design doc in the agenda notes doc, and you can take a look. And yeah, James, do you want to take over and do a presentation on this?
Sure. Hi all. I don't really have a presentation. I thought we'd just talk about the design doc.
Yep.
I think the mechanics of how to put PAM in there are a little bit less interesting than why we would want to do that. In the design doc, I've made a proposal about the mechanics of how we should do that, and I think when G and I discussed this a little bit, he had another place where we could be, where another layer in the agent stack where we could integrate it. And I think either of those would be fine. So I think more interestingly, if we discuss why I think PAM integration could be interesting, and we get some feedback around there. So for people that are not familiar with PAM, I'll talk a little bit about that. So PAM is pretty old.
So James, do you want me to share the doc in the, or you can do that?
Oh sure. Oh, let me share the doc.
Okay.
Let me see what I can select Dave.
Yeah, I think James, I agree with you. You are doing that. I think I agree with you that we should talk about the motivation why we need to do PAM support, and a little bit background will be super useful for folks to understand the motivation. Yeah, I think that works.
Am I sharing my screen or am I sharing?
Yeah, I think I can see the doc.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, from my angle, I can't tell whether I'm showing my screen or just one window of that.
I think it's just one window. Yeah.
James, can you update the link in the work group doc? I think the link in the work group doc is incorrect. It's pointing to itself.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Let me do that.
There's a table at the top of the work group doc with a collection of docs related to the working group.
Oh yeah, that works.
I think that link is correct.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so a little bit of history on PAM. PAM is pretty old. It comes from the olden days of Unix, where you had login programs like bin login, telnet, rlogin, those kind of things, xtit, whatever the X display manager was, and they all had their own custom code for how do we authenticate a user, how do we update password material, how do we deal with things like setting up a user environment. And kind of in the mid-90s, there was a team at Sun that invented an abstract API for this, and they called it PAM. The terminology around PAM is not really all that well defined. because there's like 3 or 4 slightly different forks and implementations of the API. But the NetBSD has, I think, the clearest terminology, which is linked here. The most important thing we have to understand about PAM is PAM has the notion of facilities. So a facility is a group of functionality, and generally a PAM module, which is a dynamic library loaded at runtime, deals with one or more facilities. So PAM is interested in authentication, which is how do I take a user password and know and prove that it's the user password. So authentications, so an authentication backend might be Kerberos or LDAP or Etsy password, Etsy shadow, those kind of things. This way, applications don't need to change when you move from crypt to bcrypt or any kind of whatever your password implementation happens to be. Whatever your storage is, it is opaque to any application that authenticates users.
So James, if I understand correctly, you're saying that the application should write using the PAM APIs, and then the operator can swap the module of the PAM so that like the operator can just switch the authentication mechanism. Am I understand correctly?
Yes, you're understanding correctly.
Okay.
So all the application has to do is correctly manipulate the PAM API, and you can support all authentication mechanisms from history and future. PAM has account management, which deals with things like when you're allowed to log in. So it's all the non-authentication aspects about your account. So, for example, you could use PAM account management to implement things like G is not allowed to log into this particular terminal because it's restricted for some policy reason. Right? So maybe your account is correct, your password is correct, but for some administrative reason, we're not going to allow you to log in. Session management facility deals with how we should construct your session. So a very common module is PAM make home dir. So it makes so that's a session management module. It creates your home directory based on a spec on demand. Authentication token update is the final one, and that's all about how do we update authentication tokens. So if LDAP says that you have to change your password, how do we change your password? What are the steps and the mechanics involved in that? Well, the steps depend on where your password is and how it's stored and how it's encrypted and a bunch of other things that applications really shouldn't need to know. So why does PAM make sense for a container orchestrator? I think it depends on your perspective. One perspective that we can have about container orchestration is that a container is a user session on a remote system. If we think about a container as being a user session, then it really isn't that different from SSH. Like, we're giving you orchestration and automation, and we're dealing with a lot of resources under the covers for you. But fundamentally, it's like we have a user, some external entity, the actor, and we're giving them a session on this abstract host. And if we think about it well, maybe all the things that we want PAM to do for an interactive user session could also be applied to these other kinds of sessions, which we can think of as having similar characteristics. I'm not really concerned with any of the auth facilities. Mesos already has ways of doing auth. There's auth modules. I don't think that I can't really think of a way that we could integrate PAM in a way that makes sense there.
So that's one of my kind of like thoughts is like, I think for historical reason, PAM provides a lot of like stuff like authentication and token management and things like that. I think some of the features are already there in the container orchestrator itself. For example, as you mentioned, authentication, authorization is already built in the container orchestrator like Mesos. I guess like we're looking for those features that's not yet inside container orchestrator, but it's already existing PAM, and that's something that we want from this feature. Is that the intention, or
Yeah, that's the intention.
okay?
So for example, like PAM authentication is really oriented around kind of interactive authentication, interactive logins, and that doesn't really make sense in the Mesos environment, I don't think.
I see.
PAM password change management. I don't really. That's so tightly coupled to the authentication that it also doesn't make sense. But I think if we think about if we can see running a container as being analogous to a user session, then I think that the session and account facilities can be interesting. So we have a couple of use cases, for example. On my back burner, I have a proposal to do auditing, audit support for Mesos. So I looked into the Linux audit subsystem, and one of the things Linux audit subsystem will track is a distinct audit UID, which persists across fork, and it's distinct part of your credential from your real effective and saved UIDs. Now, to set the audit UID, you have to manipulate a file in proc. But there's already a PAM module that does this, and it's a session module. So as an operator of a platform, if each of my containers ran in a unique PAM session, I could just apply the PAM login UID module to this, and then each of my PAM, and then that would automatically set up the audit UID for my container. Similarly for SE Linux.
So James, for the audit UID, is that like per process, or I mean, it will be inherited like when you fork?
It's inherited across fork, so it's
Okay.
and it's not changed by switching users either.
Okay, I see. Got it. So even if you switch user, it still has the same audit UID. I see.
Right.
But that UID has nothing to do with the actual like effective UID or like the real UID.
Exactly. It's not used for permissions. It's just used for auditing.
Got it. Okay.
So it's kind of interesting because it lets you distinguish between like, well, some audit user A later on switched credentials and did things as B, C, and D, but I still know it was originally A. So that's kind of interesting from an auditing point of view.
So how do you change the UID? For example, like, do you need special permission to, like, say, I want to change my audit UID?
Yeah, you need to be privileged, and you need to write to a file. You need to write it into /proc.
Oh, I see. Got it. Okay.
So I don't know if it's in the man page or you just have to look at the kernel. Yeah, proc self login UID is the file that you write to.
See, and you need like special privilege, like some sort of like a special capability to be able to change that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you need to run as privilege. So in general, the PAM modules should be run with privilege. So in the PAM model, generally, what you do is you run all the PAM modules with privilege, then you fork exec the child with whatever user you ended up with. And then once that child's done, then you run all your cleanup with privilege again.
Okay, makes sense.
So other use cases that I just thought up off the top of my head is so PAM env is a PAM module that lets you put things into the child's environment. So Mesos has ways already for the container orchestrator to put things into the environment, but there's no way for the platform operator to inject things as well. So there's cases where the platform operator could give a container useful information in the environment, but the only way to do that is to go and manipulate your tasks.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting. Like, I think like Mesos already allow like an operator to specify additional environment variable for executor, but not for any task at the moment.
How do you specify it for the executor?
There's an agent flag called executor environment variables. That's how you specify for executor.
Oh, there's a special flag for that.
Yes, there's a special flag for that.
Okay.
But I don't remember if there's anyone for task. I don't think so. Yeah, so tasks not. So for nested container, we don't have things like this.
So another one that so previously, I think in this forum, Ian has raised a desire to have something like a set of hooks around containers, or a very simplified kind of isolator model where operators can do things around the container lifecycle without having to write an isolator. So part of that need could be addressed by PAM exec. So PAM exec is a session facility module, and it lets you run arbitrary programs before and after the session. So there's pretty much, you can all see that man page. So PAM exec lets you specify the command. It gets the environment variables from PAM, it puts it into the environment where it executes the command, and it lets you run at different facilities. So using PAM exec, you would be able to run a program when a container starts and another program when a container ends. In our environment, we could leverage that to wire containers into our Splunk log forwarder. But you can imagine that there's plenty of kind of applications for that sort of thing. So these use cases, individually, maybe they're all pretty arbitrary, and individually they're all just little things. But I guess the big picture is that you do one thing, you make one change in the way Mesos works, and it does open up a wide range of tweaks that you can do to your containers as a platform operator, and you can take advantage of a lot of existing facilities that people have already written PAM modules for.
Yeah, I think yeah, I agree with you. I think this sounds like an extension to extension. Like right now, although the containerizer allow you to do extension using isolators, but this one allow you to basically building some basic support for PAM so that people can use arbitrary PAM modules for all the containers running inside Mesos. Yeah, I think for some of the missing features that people already have PAM module for, like auditing and maybe SE Linux, that they can directly leverage this feature. Okay.
There's probably other things too. Like there's a PAM module that sets the UMask, right? And setting the UMask is something that's probably that could easily be site specific. Is there a way to do that today? I don't think so off the top of my head.
I guess my question is how people deploy those PAM modules. Are they going to make sure that the shared library is available on the host first?
Yeah. So the deployment for PAM modules, you put the shared libraries on the host, then you put a config file which is specific to an application context. So you would have a configuration file which configures a different set of PAM modules and a different PAM workflow for Mesos than for SSHD, for example.
I see. Yeah, I think sounds like the deploy of PAM module itself is kind of a little, but I guess that's true for all the isolators right now. You have to manually deploy all the isolator share library onto every single host.
Yeah.
It's not very convenient. I was thinking about we need to have some way to simplify that workflow by deploying a new isolator or a hook to Mesos.
Yeah. I guess I'm not really expecting people to write Mesos-specific PAM modules. My expectation is more that people would use existing PAM modules in a Mesos context.
Okay.
One of the things that's a little bit sucky about PAM is PAM has the notion of items which are named, which is basically key value pairs, and which is information that is stored in your PAM context and communicated between invocations of the modules. The crappy thing about this is that they're fixed, so there's only a fixed set of items, and they're sort of oriented around interactive logins. So some of the things that are interesting in a container orchestrator context are difficult to kind of express in PAM. So, what's the container ID? PAM doesn't really let you communicate that easily. Maybe you could say the TTY is the container ID. But quite reasonably, some PAM modules might expect the PAM TTY item to be a real TTY. So I kind of
so I think Mesos Container has TTY too. So I think it will be more appropriate to use that TTY instead of like having a container ID being a TTY.
Yeah, so I think the SE Linux PAM module depends on the PAM TTY being a real TTY, because it does some TTY magic to do SE Linux labeling, which is a little bit over my head. PAM rhost, I'm thinking, PAM rhost could easily be the framework ID.
What is rhost?
It's supposed to tell you the remote host that the user's logging in from.
Oh, I see. Got it. Okay.
So it's like, so G is logging into this particular batch host from some host name, and we can tell later on that, you came from this IP address. When you have your PAM auditing enabled, there'll be an audit record that says, G logged in from this PAM R host, and it was this IP address or whatever. Right? So you can imagine maybe the framework ID makes sense there. You can have an application that takes advantage of the framework ID, and you can link it back to some kind of customer or service or application. There's a little bit of pseudocode around the process launch, which is basically cribbed from the PAM application examples. So pretty much the code workflow for this is you start up PAM reads the config file, figures out what the workflow is going to be for the modules. And you set a bunch of items into your context. This is the information that we have in the table below, so your key value pairs. Then you run account management. That invokes all the account management modules that are configured. Then you run session. You get the right user, you update your environment, you run the actual task, you wait for it, and you close and you're done. Notice the requirements around, there's a bunch of kind of implied requirements around this, which aren't kind of well stated in PAM, but are kind of implicit in the way that the API works. Because we have to close the session, it really implies that we have a parent process that waits for a child. We can't just start something up and then exec the child and forget about it. Actually, we want to close the session. We want to tear down things that we constructed. We might want to do auditing. So we want to make a pretty good effort to be able to run the closed part of the session.
Yeah, that's one of my questions. Like, what if you don't do the close for PAM? Like, what's gonna happen? Are you leaking resources or?
What happens there is very much specific to the PAM module. So I looked at the code for some of them and replied with a few examples. So there's a module called PAM warn, for example, which emits syslog messages. It just goes, someone logged in, someone's done. If you're depending on that, then it wouldn't happen. PAM XORF would leave a stale cookie file. TTY audit removes the auditing status from the TTY on N, so that would fail. PAM keyring, if you're using kernel keyrings, PAM keyring would leave a stale keyring in the kernel. The last log would leave a stale W tree. So there's a bunch of arbitrary things that could happen.
I see.
In general, I think this is sort of something that's intrinsic to the way it works, right? Like if you kill -9 SSHD, then none of these sessions are going to get cleaned up. So as a module author, you have to sort of understand that that there's some level at which the session end is going to be best effort, and try and arrange for the consequences of that to be not terrible.
I see. So basically, you're saying like it's totally up to the PAM module implementation. Some module might be fine with close not being called, but some module will definitely have some issue or leakage.
Yeah,
the close that's not being called. I think the other question I have is like, does the PAM thing has to be in the parent process of the user task, or it can be like not part of the process tree of that user task?
I think it really has to be in the parent process, because otherwise things just wouldn't work. So, for example, PAM, let me find this one. For example, like there's a PAM UMask, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the only way this could possibly work is if it's the direct parent.
I see. So it basically like rely on some inheritance assumptions.
Yeah, so that's what I mean about like the API implies some of these things, even though the documentation doesn't kind of come out and spell it. Because the only possible way a PAM UMask module could work is by setting the UMask of your current process and then expecting it to be inherited across fork.
Okay. Yeah, I won't be. Yeah, okay. So that sounds fine to me. I think I won't be too worried about this, especially like I think that only happens if you just directly secure the top level, like the nanny process, which shouldn't happen too often.
Yeah, so that's why we have like in the process I have this whole paragraph about how I think the process management needs to work. So you have to have something which I'm calling PAM Mesos PAM session, which is what we discuss as the nanny process. This nanny process kind of just sits in front of what's currently the Mesos Containerizer launch.
Mm-hmm.
Is how I've imagined it for now.
Yeah,
just if you look at
sorry. I mean, I'm just saying it's just a FYI for everybody else. I had a chat with James on this, and we were trying to see if there's a way to remove that nanny process, because I think Mesos Containerizer launch is itself a nanny process that doing signal forwarding and WAPIT, basically reaping from the sub-process tree. And sounds like a PAM session. Mesos PAM session is another nanny process. We'll try to see if there's a way to get rid of that. Just have one single nanny process. That's all the jobs.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty desirable if we can kind of bundle those together in some way.
Yeah.
So I thought about, so I'm pretty hand wavy about the actual implementation at this point. But I did write down in here in the process management requirements, basically trying to express the background of what I think process management needs to satisfy.
Mm-hmm.
So number one is PAM modules arbitrarily modify the process state, right? So that means that once we run the session setup, we can't really assume anything about the current process state. So that implies that we can't run this in a Mesos agent, for example, because it's the session modules have modified our process state in an arbitrary way, and is it still good? We don't really know. Because we need to open and close a session, it implies that we have to have some kind of nanny process that has a lifetime greater than or equal to the child. We're going to need to open and close with privilege. So things like SE Linux labeling is going to require privilege. We need to run on the agent host because that's where the PAM modules are. Trying to say, oh, sometimes PAM modules run inside a container just seems nuts. So we want to have well-defined semantics of this because it's for operators. Operators own the host, not the container. The user task has to be a direct child because you're forking, right? Because you condition the thing and then you fork. So. So that's pretty much it. I think the main reason for bringing it to the larger group is to get a sense of whether people feel that this is a useful capability, whether people think that this is an approach that has potential or that they're going to find helpful.
Yeah, I think from my end, I think it's definitely interesting, and I think we do want to do some interesting thing around things like SE Linux that we don't have direct support from Mesos yet. I think I view this like a quick way of getting some support from existing modules before we make those things first class inside the container orchestrator. Like for example, things like SE Linux, we can, if there's a module already and we have this support, then we can directly leverage that and apply SE Linux labels to processes, and that'll be useful, I think, for sure, for us.
Hey James, one question I have is how you envision how users and operators will interact with the feature. Will it be enabled and disabled via a flag? Will there be any API changes?
I imagined that it would be an agent flag, because this is really something for operators rather than framework authors or people running containers. I hadn't thought too closely about that, but I imagined that it would be an agent flag.
Okay, that sounds pretty good to me. I think one of my initial concerns was just exposing too many operating system level primitives directly via Mesos APIs. If it's just something like an agent flag, it's pretty much a black box. It can be switched on or off, and then it seems like all the configuration would reside on the agents themselves.
The configuration is all on agents. Yeah, thinking about it a bit more, because the configuration is all on agents, I don't think that anyone that's actually scheduling a container would be able to know whether turning PAM on or off would make sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. But I should update the doc to make that clear.
Yeah, I think I'll say this is useful for us. And I think it's definitely useful for the case where like the operator is very opinionated about something and they want to do some custom extension, just not there in Team Mesos. So I would say this is pretty useful, as long as we make this an optional things that we can turn off if people don't want to enable that. Because there might be some security concern. Like, how do you make sure that the module is not? Yeah, I guess like who's gonna validate the module? Is there a way to validate the module is well behaved? Things like that.
Red Hat shipped it. It's good enough for me.
Okay, I see. Okay, I see. Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think like it'll be nice to have an optional flag to turn this. Well, we have to do this. So
do you happen to know for the pro users who's not on Red Hat, does Ubuntu or Debian ship any useful PAM modules?
Yeah, everyone ships the set. Everyone ships the same set, more or less. So there's really only three implementations of PAM. There's the Solaris one, there's Linux PAM, and there's OpenPAM. So PAM is one of those things that everybody uses every day, but no one kind of realizes. So every Linux. Okay, let me back that off a little bit. All the major Linux distros use PAM. All the major general purpose distros use PAM. The cloud container distros, I'm not actually sure. So stuff like Alpine Linux, does that have PAM? I'm not sure. I'd have to Google that one.
Thank you for the answer. This is great.
Yeah, I think besides the comment about like optional flag, I think the other comment is I really want to see if we can not introduce additional nanny process. That will complicate a bunch of things. I wish like we can have a solution, just have one nanny process.
Yeah.
The other comments.
It seems like there is already an agent configuration for launcher flag. Should we simply make this as a third launcher, like Linux-PAM or simply PAM?
Yeah, so down the end, one of the way imagined doing it was as a launcher. One of the reasons why I looked at it, I thought about it as a launcher was because I wanted to avoid doing the signal forwarding dance that that we would otherwise have to do. So I imagined it as a kind of a forwarding launcher. So I think that's an implementation choice, but I'm tending to agree with G that I think that doing it as a launcher is fairly complex because you want to be a launcher, but you basically want to also retain the C group semantics probably.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't, if you're a PAM launcher, you don't also want to re-implement the Linux launcher or the project launcher. So then you have this kind of weird forwarding behavior, which is not that easy to understand.
And also signal forwarding is kind of like a little tricky to get right. And since we already have that logic in one of the nanny process, let's try to see if we can just reuse that. I think that sounds pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy that we have this. I'm all for this feature. And for the exact use case, I still need to chat with some of the security folks. I think they mentioned some SE Linux integration on this, but I still need to chat with them, see what exactly the SE Linux feature they are expecting from this feature. But I think in general, I'm all for this. And for some of the simple modules like auditing, that's definitely useful.
Cool.
Yeah, me too. I think it looks interesting.
Yeah, I did put an extra comment in here somewhere.
Yeah.
I'm not kind of proposing this really much from so much as a security feature.
It's more to me as an extension that you can leverage existing modules rather than like saying this is a security feature. Because
yeah, I agree. So I'd be a bit hesitant to go and kind of describe this as a security feature to people. It has some security aspects, but it's more like a get out of jail free card for operators.
Yeah, so regarding one of the use cases you list here, like the last one, exact and arbitrary command when task begin and ends. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think this to me, like I'm still more in favor of using like an isolator or like even like allow user to give a container that contains command that allow people to run before the task start and after the task and things like that, rather than like rely on PAM modules. I think short term it's okay, but I think long term, I think the goal is trying to generally move those features to be inside Mesos and the Mesos specific, rather than just like an arbitrary PAM module which is written for some different purpose, and we just try to reuse that. But I'm not sure exactly like what's the consequence. You have to test every single module to make sure that's
that depends on the audience, right? I think for Mesos users, there's lots of interesting use cases for running commands in containers, before your main task and after your main task. And I guess the Kubernetes pods concept lets you do that in kind of interesting ways. And as a user, I can really take advantage of that. This sort of isn't for users.
Yeah, this is for operators to inject some settings for each container and then tear down that.
I think that argument is still on for even using an isolator, because right now I don't think user can write a good API for a framework side to selectively invoke an isolator or not. So any isolator, as long as the operator enable them, they'll at least be executed unconditionally to each container.
Yeah, so we don't allow that. I think that's a deliberate decision that we don't want the users to be aware of the isolator. I think isolator is just like an operator choice. We do have like some isolator do allow framework to make some tweaks, like for example, whether they share pin namespace or not, things like this. But we want to control those APIs. So we don't want to directly expose what isolators and the framework can use. I think that's too much for a framework writer to be aware of.
I have a question about PAM exec. I'm kind of wondering, since it was stated that the PAM configuration and all that is going to live on the host and not in containers, and it's going to be an operator configuration. When PAM exec runs something, is that running something on the host? Is it running something in the container? Where is it consuming resources from?
That would always run something on the host.
Okay, so it would consume host resources and it would run in the host namespace.
Yes.
Okay.
That depends on when you do put the process into the C group. If you put the process into the C group before you do PAM exec, then it's going to be inside the containers resources.
Well, I think that's a pretty important aspect of the design that it might make sense to call out here if it's not already called out, because if it's consuming host resources, I want to know, and if it's consuming container resources, that means it's constrained, and maybe it's on a different network at that point because it's been isolated. I don't know. It just seems like
so. Yeah, so I think it's definitely not containerized. So it's definitely running in the host network context, in the host file, in the host mount namespace. So in terms of containerization, it's fully host.
So James, I think we should double check that. I'm pretty sure that right now the nanny process will enter in our namespace for nested container, but not the top level container. I'm not exactly sure. I need to double check too, but let's double check on this.
Yeah, but I think the requirements for the semantics are that this thing should run on the host. I think we can go back and forth on whether it runs in the task C group or not. That's kind of an implementation choice that we should nail down and make clear to everybody.
So what happens if this is exactly in a different network namespace? If we do the PAM exec in a different network namespace than the host network namespace, what's going to happen? I think it should not be affected as long as you have network.
But I think that what happens is then unpredictable. So if you're trying to do something as an operator and you're trying to exec something, and then what's going to happen is you're going to run some command, and it's going to run in the host mount containers, and it's going to be partly in a container, and partly not. I think the semantics for containerization should be well defined, and I think because of the way PAM works, it has to be that it's on the host.
Okay, yeah. So
if we put it partly in the container, then I can sort of see maybe you could do something interesting, but then you end up in a weird, inconsistent world that's hard to explain and hard to kind of manage.
Okay, yeah. So if that's the case, then I think we need to do some restructure of that nanny process to make sure that we have a chance to run something in the host environment before we actually enter the container environment, because I think right now the code is like for that nanny process always in the container context, at least for regarding the network namespaces or other namespaces.
That might be one of the reasons why I originally proposed doing this in the launcher, because once you get down into
but I think it's doable.
So you're kind of half in.
Yeah. But I guess this is something that we want to do anyway for a long time, especially we want to support a case where the nanny process is not pit one inside the container. Some people prefer that, and also some container, for example, I want to run systemd, and systemd has to be pit one inside the container, and right now we don't support that case. So I think this is something that we want to do anyway. So I will try to see.
So that would be a nanny so that would be like hoisting the nanny process from the containerizer up to something above it.
Yeah. So make that nanny process outside the containers pin namespace. Make the user test as pit one, so that make that optional. So basically, some people prefer like I don't want to handle like reaping as pit one. People don't have that logic. So sometimes people prefer like having that nanny process pit one, but sometimes people prefer like, hey, I want to run systemd in my container. I don't want you to be pit one. Otherwise, I cannot run my container. So we want to support both use cases.
What are the semantics of having a nanny process outside the PID namespace? If PID one in the namespace is not reaping, will the nanny process outside the namespace be able to?
No, you cannot. So that process, so the process will be zombied inside the PID namespace.
Okay. Until the namespace ends, at which point the nanny would reap everything.
Yeah, and also we don't rely on I think killing the container don't rely on the That's semantics. We're just using freezer to kill. We don't rely on any of the pinning space feature to kill.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that the implementation of PAM stuff is straightforward. The finding the right place in the agent stack and getting the process management right is more challenging here.
Yes, exactly. But I think that's a useful thing to do anyway, because I want to do that for a long time, because I think supporting systemd in a container is pretty important. Like a lot of containers rely on that. We should try to make that happen.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool, actually.
Yeah. All right. That's cool. I think that's very useful. And like, are you gonna? I think this is like we don't. I think this is kind of a design doc. I think that's good enough. And I think once we agree on the implementation plan, we can just start working on that. Yeah, I'll be happy to shepherd this work. It's pretty interesting.
Oh, thanks, Stu. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Any other questions? Okay, no, I think that's it for today's working group. If you have any questions, feel free to Slack in the containerization Slack channel in Mesos Slack, or send email to the mailing list. I think we don't have a dedicated mailing list. If you have any specific question about containerization, just using the title with like a containerization working group, just like this for those meeting notes emails, and then we can reply to you. I think that's a priority requirement that every single conversation should be public in the mailing list. Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I see there's PAM env, which looks like it's a way to inject environment variables, and I guess I'm wondering about potential overlap with other things that depend on critical environment variables, and how do we prevent or guard against environment variables getting stomped on that shouldn't be? Is that even a legitimate concern? Maybe it's not.
It's probably not a major concern, because I think I think only operator is supposed to use PAM modules, and if operator config the agent wrong or config the node wrong, then there's nothing we can do in that case. I think we always trust the operator to do the right thing.
But I think there will be ways to shoot yourself in the foot with this.
Yeah, there will be cases where you have something that overriding the environment variable, which is critical for things like, for example, the process. Then it will be a problem. So, but there's nothing that I mean, if operator is malicious, then there's nothing can prevent him from doing the wrong things.
Yeah, it probably will be worth calling out directly in documentation some known pitfalls maybe that people could avoid.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Does that address your question, James?
Yeah, I think I'd be more than happy with documentation around known pitfalls. It'd be great.
Okay, sounds good. Any other questions? All right, I think that's it for today. Thanks everyone, and have a great day. See you guys.
Thanks guys. Thanks, James.
Thanks.